Hey guys, and welcome to Taylor Tech. So after sharing my network diagram with the home labbing community as I was putting together my home network, and after my pfSense video where I showed the network diagram again, I started getting a lot of questions about one of the items on there, which was Zentyal, which I had listed as my primary domain controller. A lot of people wanted to know what I thought of Zentyal and how it worked out for me. So now that I've got it up and running and doing a lot of the things that I wanted to do, I thought I'd share some of those thoughts with you, as well as give an overview of what a domain controller is and what it can do for you if you're unfamiliar with that. So if you look back at my home virtualization video, when we were setting up Hyper-V and trying to get Windows 10 to connect to it, there was a lot of just crap that we had to go through, editing weird, esoteric settings to try and get it to have the security to connect to it. What we were trying to do was connect a workgroup's computer to a workgroup server, which is not really the way that Windows is intended to work. The Windows environment is really meant to have a domain controller, that is something that is handling all of the single sign-on across multiple systems. In Windows terms, this would normally be Active Directory, which is their domain controller service that Windows has on Windows Server. Unfortunately, Windows Server costs a lot of money, so that was not really going to be an option for me if I wanted a domain controller in my home environment. So I looked around for other options, and what I came across was Zentyal. So what exactly is a domain controller? Well, if you only have one or two systems in your environment, a domain controller is not really going to be for you. It's going to be more work than is really required to set it up, and you can manage one or two systems easily just by, picking them up and doing what you need to do. When you start getting to 5, 6, 7, 10 plus systems, between servers and workstations and laptops and home theater PCs and whatnot, it starts to make a lot more sense to have a domain controller. And as I'm building out my home lab environment, I'm starting to realize I don't like managing all of this stuff on a one-off basis. I'd much rather have a central way to manage all of my single sign-on, manage, policies across multiple systems. So I decided to look into setting up a domain controller. I mentioned very briefly that you can set policies for systems with a domain controller. This is probably one of the more powerful things that you can do. And if you're like me and you're basically managing all of your family's computers, it's something you may want to strongly consider if you haven't thought about it before. Just a few examples of some of the things you can do with a domain controller by setting policies, at least in a Windows environment. You can pre-install antivirus for them. You can automatically map shared drives. You can set up a homepage for them if you have like a jump off homepage that you want people to use for, different services you've installed for them. You can prevent the installation of specific software or prevent installing any software at all. And there's really a lot more. You can set hours during which a computer can be used. All of these kind of things that would be really handy, especially for parents out there who may have small kids or, kids that they're concerned about what their computer habits are like. One of the big downsides to using a domain controller, though, at least in a Windows environment, is that you have to have the professional version of Windows, either Windows 7 Pro or Windows 10 Pro for it to work. And those keys can be a little bit more expensive. Now, if you're building your systems, it's not going to be that big of a deal. The OEM keys for Windows 10 are about $100, maybe $80 or $90 if you catch a good sale. Whereas the Windows 10 Pro keys are, for OEM keys are only going to be about $120 or $140, depending on where you pick them up. The full-blown retail version is about $180, so it is a bit more of an investment. Personally, I usually go with OEM keys because systems tend to last me long enough that I'm going to be upgrading Windows when I upgrade my system. The one big downside, though, is that if you do have a laptop or some sort of pre-built system, you are going to have to go ahead and purchase that key outright, so you have to think about that cost in addition to the system. So as I mentioned during the intro, a full-blown Windows Server with Active Directory was not really going to be in the cards for me because of the cost. The basic license for a Windows Server is a couple $100, and more than I would probably spend on the system itself. And I really didn't want to invest that much in a copy of Windows Server. So what I found to be the best replacement for Active Directory out there is Zentyal. What Zentyal is a Ubuntu-based Linux small business server that is meant to be the all-in-one server for a small business environment. It has a lot of functionality beyond just being a domain controller. It also provides DNS, firewall, a mail service, certificate authority, and there's more built into it. I think it has a Jabber server that you can use. A lot of it is functionality that I haven't gotten around to using yet, or that I don't want to use. I already have pfSense as my firewall and gateway. I don't really need Zentyal for that as well. But I did find that the DNS and domain controller functionality in it worked really well, and was exactly what I needed for my purpose. Since those are the two modules that I really keyed in on and focused on, those are the two modules we're going to be focusing on in this video. So the thing that you have to understand about Zentyal is none of the stuff is really custom built by the Zentyal team. It's really more of an amalgamation of other services that already exist in the Linux universe, that they've combined them into a unique package for small businesses. So when the DNS service in Zentyal is really just a Bind9 server, which is probably the most ubiquitous DNS server out there. And then the domain controller service is provided by Samba, which is why it integrates seamlessly into Windows systems. In fact, it integrates so seamlessly that you can actually use the Microsoft tools that come with Windows 10 Pro to control the domain controller portion of Zentyal. Once I did the initial setup, I didn't really do any work within the Zentyal dashboard on my domain controller. Everything was done with users and Active Directory users' computers, group policy editor, and just using the tools built into Windows. So from that standpoint, it's actually really nice because you really don't have to you don't have to learn a whole lot of new things if you've already learned how to manage a Windows Active Directory environment. So now we're going to switch over to the computer. We're going to go through the basic setup process of getting Zentyal set up in your home environment. I've got a little lab that I've put together on my virtualization server, and we're going to go through all the steps that you're going to need in assuming you have a relatively similar setup with a pfSense router, a Windows 10 box, and you want to put Zentyal in as the domain controller. So let's go over there and do that. Okay guys, so let's go ahead and go through a basic install and setup of Zentyal. So I've went ahead and prepared a little lab environment here. I've got a Windows 10 box that is basically just an empty shell right now. I've got the lab router, which is putting a firewall between my main network and the lab environment, and then this little lab domain controller. I have not even installed anything on it yet, so we're going to go ahead and fire it up and run through the setup process real quick. Does not take very long. There's not a lot that you actually do during the setup process other than giving it a host name and setting up the initial account for it. All right, host name. That's crazy that it remembers that. Continue. So we're setting up that first account and the host name. Okay, so once the install finishes and it reboots, you should be able to log in from the system. You'll need to be connected directly. You won't be able to connect to it remotely yet. Don't save. All right, and here's where you'll select the modules that you'll want to install. So we want to install the domain controller and the DNS server, and it will go and download some additional packages and get them installed. Let's go through the rest of the configuration process. Of course, the etho is internal. We want it to be static. This is very important if it's going to be a domain controller. So the IP address is going to be 192.168.1.2. Gateway is 192.168.1.1, and the domain name server that I want it to use after itself, of course, is 10.0.10.1, which is my outer networks domain server, which I've already set up the firewall for the lab to allow it to connect to. It's going to be a standalone. The domain name for it, we'll call it labnet.local. Okay. And it'll configure the things that we just set. Okay. Now that it's done with the initial config, we'll go to the dashboard. So there is one other thing that you will want to do before you leave the direct connection to the Zentyal server, and that will be making sure that all of your networks can access it, at least can access the bind service on it, the DNS service. So it will have already, during that initial setup, set up the DNS record for your domain that you created for the domain controller service. But what you'll want to do, if you have additional networks other than the one that the NIC on the Zentyal server is attached to, so the Zentyal is attached to 192.168.1 network. If I had additional networks I wanted to be able to connect to it that are outside of that, I have to go in edit the actual bind9 configuration files to allow that. So we're going to do that real quick. So the bind server is located in etc/bind. Wait, what? cd. Oh, I can't type. etc bind. And then we want to sudo nano named.conf.local. My typing is so good. Okay, so if you have additional networks, you will want to add them to this ACL trusted, and you simply add them like you see down here on the ACL internal local NES, just the IP address that represents the network and the CIDR extension for it. So once you have done that, you can exit this and save any changes, and we're ready to start configuring. So you can continue to configure from here, or if you want to, you can actually go to your machine, local machine, and open up a web browser and go to it in the browser. Note this 8443 port extension. You have to use that when you're connecting to it, and you also have to connect with HTTPS. So you cannot use standard HTTP, and it is not a standard port. It's 8443. So make sure that that is how you connect to it. Actually, let's hop over to the Win10 box and we'll connect to it that way. So HTTPS. So I've already typed it in here before. I've got my IP address, and if I wanted to, actually I could do, well, actually no, it's not set up that way. Now I can't use the domain name yet because this machine is not using the Zentyal box is the DNS server. So we'll set that up in pfSense here in a moment. So you'll get a certificate error because the certificate is not owned by someone else. Log in, and we have the same dashboard that we have from the actual connected machine, so you don't need this anymore. All right, so finishing configuring DNS. The only other thing, you can add additional domains if you have them. If you have hosts under LabNet, you can just add additional host names with different IP addresses. That's how I've configured mine. I did notice one weird thing about the DNS server on Zentyal is that you have to have a top level domain. So if I wanted to have just Zentyal as the domain for the Zentyal server, it won't let me do that. It'll be Zentyal dot in a blank top level domain. I don't know exactly why it's that way. I've tried to see if I could find something online to tell me how to fix that, but unfortunately I'm not having much luck. So just throwing that out there, if you're trying to set up a domain name without a top level domain and it doesn't seem like it's working, it's because it expects that dot even if the top level domain is not there. I use the transparent DNS cache. That way, if I have already gotten a DNS name from an upstream server, or a DNS entry from an upstream server, I don't have to go out and requery it. You can of course use a DNS forwarder if you want to specify a specific DNS server. So if you're like an OpenDNS fan, you can specify that here instead of letting it pick its own DNS server to hit after itself. So at this point, you're done with DNS setup, and it's time to actually set up the domain controller. So the first thing, come to domain and settings, and make sure everything looks good here. There's your NetBIOS name, your realm, which is the domain. And then the server description, Zentyal Server, looks good. And the drive letter is the drive letter it will use for all user drives. So it includes functionality for having a home drive, similar to that you may have at work in a corporate environment. And you can set what that drive letter is here. And it will default to that on all systems that connect to it. So once you've confirmed that, once DNS is set up and you've confirmed that the domain is how you want, you can come to users and computers and add yourself a user. Now you've got the default administrator, domain admin, schema admin. Go ahead and create yourself a new user. Call this guy test user. We'll just call him test actually. And test user. And give him a password of 123. And we'll add him to domain admins because I'm lazy. Don't use a domain admin count for your main account. Bad. Have a specific domain account that is for domain admins for adding machines to the domain. Anyway, all right. So we've added our user and we're ready to go. The next thing we need to do is we need to configure the router on the network to use that server as the DNS server. So come back over to pfSense, your general setup, and change your DNS server to that server. 192.168.1.2. Save. Okay. Change has been applied successfully, and we need to restart our network connection to get the new DNS server. And we can come down. Ping. Let's do NS lookup. So we can see that our DNS server is now serving domain names to us. It hit labdc.labnet.local and gave us the IP address for Google. Awesome. So we've got DNS set up. We're ready to use the domain controller on this machine. So adding a Windows machine to a Zentyal domain is the same as adding it to an Active Directory domain. If you've not done it on Windows 10 before, it's real simple. Go to Settings, Accounts, Access Work or School, click Connect, and then join this device to a local Active Directory domain. Domain name, not actually in the box, labnet.local. Next, it'll ask me for my username that I'm using to connect, which is test and 123. Okay, since that account is a domain admin, it will allow me to add the machine. I'm going to create a user account of test as a admin. So I'll make it a standard user. Next, you can use any domain account at that point to add it, and we go ahead and restart, and the machine will be part of the domain. All right, let's just reconnect to Labs DC real quick. I want to show one thing while that is restarting. So under users and computers, this test user, you'll note that the user quota is set limited to 500 megabytes. You can set quotas by user here, and that does use the drive on the domain controller. You can also disable it if you don't want them to have one. So I leave it on. I find it useful for passing things between machines. All right, so now we're logging in with a domain account with our super complex password here. Okay, so normally if you wanted to add the Active Directory tool set to a Windows professional installation, you would come here to turn Windows features on and off and just enable it and go. Unfortunately, Windows 10, they changed that process a little bit. You actually have to go out and download it. You have to go download what's called Remote Server Administration Tools, or RSAT. And that contains the tool set that you need to manage an Active Directory server. So we're going to download it. Once you've installed RSAT, you'll have the full suite of Active Directory tools, and we'll go through the important ones that you will need to use to manage this domain controller. Okay, so now that we've got RSAT installed, we can start actually looking at our domain controller. So everything should be under administrative tools. No? System. No. Ah, there they are. Took it a minute to update. Okay. So the important ones here are users and computers, which we'll go ahead and open. So there's LabNet, there's our users that we created, and there's our test user. So this is where you will generally be doing most of your management from. The one you don't want to mess with is this DNS Lab DC, which is created by Zentyal as the basically the service account that the web application uses to administer the domain controller to the, so you'll see that it is a member of domain admin, of DNS admins. So anyway, so you don't want to mess with this is the one that you don't want to mess with. So from here you can add additional users, you can add additional organizational units, and you can add groups. You can do everything you can do with a standard Active Directory server. The other thing that you'll want to spend some time with is group policy. So let's go to group policy editor, or group policy management rather, sorry. And here you can edit the group policy for the domain. So you can do it for, again, any of the organizational units or the default domain policy, and you can do all of your standard GPO edits. So let's go to settings. And edit. And there's our group policy management editor that actually, where we can actually edit things. All right, so just to give you an overview of some of the stuff that's in here, you can automatically map drives, you can have applications automatically install, you can set environment variables, there's a ton of things that you can do in here. You can turn things on and off on control panel, or set specific settings on the control panel. You can just do a multitude of things. So far, the only thing that I'm doing with group policy in my home environment is mapping drives. So it gives you an idea of some of the stuff you can do with group policy, and how to get in and start editing it. Remember that group policy applies either at the domain level or at the organizational unit level. So that makes it really important when you're setting up your users and setting up their organizational units and what organizational unit they're a part of. If different people are going to have different group policy, they need to be in different OUs. You can nest organizational units, but remember that all levels of group policy are going to apply. The parent organizational unit and the child organizational unit will both get the same group policy. And they'll inherit up the chain. Hopefully that's helpful, gives you an idea of what you can do with Zentyal and how easily it works with all of the Windows Active Directory tools. A handful of them don't work, and those are generally the ones that are meant to manage the Active Directory server itself, not managing the users on the server, the Active Directory environment, but actually the Active Directory server itself. And that's because it isn't actually an Active Directory server. One in particular that I was messing around with, the Active Directory Administrative Center, will not work. And that's because it is looking for an actual Microsoft Active Directory server. The ones that are important here are users and computers. So you can set your organizational units, set up your users, and the group policy stuff. Those are really the two that you want to focus on. I think that covers everything for the basic setup, where we went through, we installed Zentyal. We got it in the initial configuration done. We set up the DNS server module. We got that as the DNS for the network by editing our router configuration. We set up the domain controller module, and then we joined a computer to the domain and went in with the Windows Active Directory tools after installing RSAT so that we could actually manage the domain controller, the Zentyal domain controller, using the Active Directory management tools. Whew. All right. Let's go ahead and hop back over. All right, guys. Now I know that wasn't super detailed in terms of like how to utilize the domain controller. It was more just how to get it set up and running. And to be frank, I'm still figuring out how I'm going to utilize it best in my environment. I just wanted to show you what functionality is out there, how to use that basic functionality, and give you maybe a few ideas of some of the things that you can do with it. Alright guys, I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, throw a like on it. Also leave any comments or questions you have for me in the comment section down below. This video itself was actually driven by comments and questions that some of y'all were asking me. If you'd like to support what I'm doing on this channel, you can do so by using the Amazon affiliate link in the description section down below. Really appreciate it when you guys do that. That really helps me and helps fund future projects so I can do more cool stuff for you. Thanks for watching guys. Have a good one.